Let's all thank my mother, Melissa announced into the microphone. Her voice carried across the oak-paneled lodge. Not just for writing the checks, but for still believing she's a legend in her own head. Laughter. Light, then growing. A few claps. A whistle. Judith didn't move. She sat still at table 11. The white linen in front of her was dotted with wine rings and a slice of untouched cake. Her fingers curled slightly around the base of her water glass. Her knuckles were white. The heat flushed to her ears, then down her neck. But she didn't blink. She kept her eyes locked on the pine beam above the sweetheart table. She had paid for that beam, for the florist to hang soft fairy lights across it, for the sweetheart table, for Melissa's dress, the 3-tier cake, and the plated halibut every guest was now half finishing. The laughter settled into murmurs. Melissa smiled radiant, perfect in ivory. Her new husband, Nathan, stared at the ceiling. His cheeks were stiff. Anyway, Melissa said, still grinning. Here's to new beginnings. Applause. Judith slowly exhaled. The air moved from deep in her chest, past the cracked edge of her voice, and out her nose. She dabbed her napkin to her lip, where the lipstick had faded. A waiter passed. She waved him off. The cake on her plate remained uneaten. Vanilla with raspberry, Melissa's favorite. Judith had argued for lemon. Just once in the planning meeting, she was outvoted. From the far end of the room, someone rose. A man in a tailored navy suit. Salt and pepper hair thick, clean lines, confident shoulders. He'd been seated with the Beckstruck table, Nathan's colleagues. Judith had noticed him earlier but hadn't placed his face. Now he was moving. Toward the mic, but he hadn't reached it yet. Judith's thought spun slow and sharp. Legend in her own head. She had designed bridges in Idaho, highways in Wyoming, and the North Bypass outside Missoula. She had worn steel-toed boots when Melissa still needed a step stool to reach the sink. She had put Melissa through college. Twice. She had paid for this wedding. And now, she was the joke. She reached for her clutch. Leather. Gift from her late husband. Her hand hovered. Should she walk out? The cake was melting. The candles were low. Her name had just been erased, publicly, neatly like chalk from a school board. Nobody looked at her. Not even Nathan. But the man in the suit did. His eyes, pale gray, locked onto hers across the wooden floor. He gave a subtle nod. Judith didn't nod back. She didn't trust herself to move. She tasted bitterness on her tongue. Was it the wine? Or shame? Don't let them silence your name. Her late husband's words echoed faint. The man in the suit was 2 steps from the mic. Judith's grip tightened on the clutch. The room had not gone silent, not yet. But something had shifted. A string in the air pulled tight. She breathed in slowly. Something was about to happen. He raised his glass. To the woman who paid for all this, but still needs to learn when to stay silent. Laughter exploded across the ballroom. My name was never mentioned. Not once. Not when the toasts began. Not when the slideshow rolled through childhood memories I helped build. Not even when the newlyweds walked table to table, thanking guests, skipping mine like I didn't exist. But now, finally, I was acknowledged. As a punchline, I sat frozen under the chandelier I chose, blinking at the crystal that sparkled like it might shatter. The room spun with wine and white lilies. My daughter's voice echoed in my head. Mum, don't bring up your projects tonight. Just enjoy the evening. Be normal. Normal was shrinking, smiling politely. Paying for the caterer who forgot my dietary needs. Wearing beige so I wouldn't draw attention. Normal was becoming invisible so my daughter could shine. But I'd built the foundation she stood on. I'd laid concrete in steel, toed boots while pregnant with her. Drafted blueprints between school pickups. My name was on buildings up and down the Bozeman skyline. But tonight, it was gone, erased. A busboy cleared my plate. All done, ma'am, I nodded, though I'd barely touched the roasted duck. At the next table, I heard Rachel say, she means well. But you know how moms get when they hit that age, always needing a hobby. Needing, like I was a project to fix, a room to redecorate. Jake, the groom, chuckled. Better a hobby than a lawsuit, right? That's when I saw him, table 7, corner seat, navy suit, loosened tie, Mr. Harold Whitmore, chairman of the largest architecture firm in Montana, my former mentor. The man who once told me, Judith, when your name goes on a blueprint, they listen. He was watching me, and he didn't look amused. In that second, something in me straightened. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was 5 years of being underestimated folding into a tight steel beam in my chest. I stood. My chair scraped sharply across the marble. Conversations paused. Forks hovered midair. "Excuse me?" I said, voice steady. I walked toward the stage, heels silent on the carpet. Rachel spotted me halfway and hissed, "Mom, what are you doing?" I didn't answer. Mr. Whitmore met my eyes and gave a single nod. The microphone was still warm. I picked it up. "Hey, everyone," I said. "I'm Judith Meyers, the bride's mother." Silence. "Since we're making toasts, I thought I'd offer one more. Not to the couple, they have plenty." I paused. "But to the past, and the names we carry." Rachel went pale. I looked at her, then at Mr. Whitmore, then at the room. 37 years ago, I laid the first steel frame of the Myers Medical Pavilion. Gasps. Some heads turned. That project launched my firm, funded this wedding, built this ballroom. But I was asked not to talk about that tonight. My voice didn't waver. I was told to stay quiet, be normal, let the young ones shine. I scanned the guests, but tonight I was erased. A pause. You could hear the air shift. "So here's my toast," I said. "To every woman over 60 who's been asked to shrink so others feel taller. To every mother who paid for the meal but was served silence." Then I raised the glass Jake left on the edge. We don't vanish. We don't retire from mattering, and we never stop building. Click! A single glass lifted at table 7. Mr. Whitmore. The room held its breath. "We just want everything to be perfect," Melissa said, pressing her French, manicured fingers to her temple as she looked me over. I stood in the corner of the rehearsal venue, watching her shake her head. My blouse, pale lilac silk, freshly steamed, suddenly felt like a costume from another decade. One bridesmaid whispered something behind her palm, then burst into giggles. Maybe something more age-appropriate? Melissa offered, not unkindly, but with that voice, the one you use to explain things to a confused child. I smiled tightly. "It's just the rehearsal. I figured this would do." "Of course," she nodded quickly, already turning away. "We just want everyone in photos to feel cohesive." I wasn't in the photos. Not really. The church was beautiful. Bozeman summers gave us that deep golden light through stained glass windows. The aisle had been rehearsed 3 times already, and each time, I stood off to the side, watching, holding my breath as Melissa walked hand in hand with Michael, laughing, correcting the flower girl, adjusting ribbons. I didn't expect a standing ovation, but I didn't expect to be invisible either. "Mom, maybe don't bring the gift bags out yet," Michael said when I rolled in a suitcase full of personalized welcome bags I'd made myself. "There's kind of a plan for all that?" I froze. "Of course, just thought it might help." "No, it's sweet," he said, glancing toward Melissa. "Just maybe after the dinner." I wheeled them quietly back to my car. At dinner, the seating chart was tight. I was placed next to Aunt Bev and a man named Curtis who spoke only in short sentences about Montana weather. I could barely see Michael and Melissa from where I sat. But I watched them easily, clearly adored. "Isn't it just the most beautiful love story?" A woman beside me whispered. "Melissa's so classy. She brings out the best in Michael." I nodded and took a sip of lukewarm water. The maid of honor stood, clinking her glass. "To the bride!" And her amazing vision, every detail, down to the rose gold flatware. Perfection. Melissa beamed. "And to the parents." I straightened in my chair. "To Mr. and Mrs. Crane, for hosting such a gorgeous wedding weekend. And of course, to Judith Meyers, for raising such a sweet groom." Scattered claps, a polite glance my way. No one stood. No mention of my half of the budget of my 10 months helping plan or the 27 centerpieces I assembled myself. I smiled and clapped too. Afterward, in the parking lot, I lingered near my car. The wind caught my shawl, made it flap like a forgotten curtain. "You okay, Mom?" Michael asked, coming up behind me. He sounded tired. "Of me? Of course. It was a lovely speech. Melissa's just under a lot of pressure. You know how she gets." "Sure." He shoved his hands into his pockets. "You being here, that matters. Even if it doesn't always look like it." That was the first time I realized sometimes love speaks in absences. In not being mentioned, in not being seen. That night, I stood in the guest house kitchen, holding one of the welcome bags. I opened it. Each item was intentional: a lavender sachet for calm, hand, labeled bottles of water, trail mix with a tag that read, "Fuel for love?" I made them with pride, and now I wasn't sure they'd even be handed out. I texted Emily, my niece, "Still want to help with makeup tomorrow?" She replied immediately, "Yes! Aunt Jude, your hands are magic!" I stared at the screen. I hadn't realized how much I needed that. Just one person who saw me. The real me. I looked out the window into the night. The main house lit up, laughter trailing through the glass. I was tired of waiting for an invitation into their joy, tired of translating humiliation into grace. I picked up my planner, flipped to tomorrow's page. A note I had scribbled months ago stared back at me: final invoice half, due June 1st, balance July 15th. I had paid it all already. And yet the cost kept rising. No one noticed I stayed outside an extra hour that night. They were busy taking family photos without me. I wasn't angry. Not yet, but the silence was beginning to hum. And humming things eventually shake loose. They thought I paid for silence. But what I bought was time, enough time to understand exactly who I was dealing with. It started with a receipt. A folded slip tucked inside my drawer beneath rolls of emergency tape and old batteries. The kind of drawer every mother has. The kind where things go to be forgotten, except I hadn't forgotten. Not really. The receipt was from Rosalind Events. 5 months ago. 018-750. Might check my signature. Not one word of thanks. Melissa had said, back then, with her arms wrapped around me at brunch, "Mom, this wedding will be our dream. But only if we can keep it simple, you know? Intimate. Intimate turned into 160 people. Simple turned into custom lanterns, imported linen runners, and a champagne tower no one could reach without standing on tiptoes. Back then, I offered the money quietly. A gift, a mother's joy. I told myself it wasn't about control. It was about love. But love doesn't vanish when the check clears. And what I saw at the dress rehearsal made it clear. They wanted my money, not my presence. I sat at my kitchen table, the receipt pressed flat beneath a cold mug of tea. Outside, the breeze carried the sound of children on bicycles. It was the kind of day that made you wish for second chances. I didn't want revenge. Not yet. I just wanted understanding. I needed to know who knew what. So I opened my old laptop, clicked open the wedding folder they'd shared with me months ago and never updated. Dead links. Outdated schedules. My name, once listed under support team, was now gone, removed. A chill crept up my spine, so I called Steven, my lawyer since Alan and I divorced. He once joked I'd be the only client who brought lemon bars to a prenup signing. He picked up on the third ring. "Judy, everything okay? I need to ask you about a gift." He was quiet, then cautious. A gift or a transaction? That's what I'm trying to figure out. I told him about the payment, the silence that followed. How I paid Rosalind directly, per Melissa's request. How no one ever spoke of it again. "Did you sign anything that defined it as a gift?" "No. Just a check." With a memo line that said, "Venue deposit." Stephen exhaled. "Then it's not a gift. It's a contract starter." A crack split through my chest. They knew I was the one footing the bill. They just chose to forget. "You still have control," Stephen said. "If your name's on the contract, you can pull it." My heart pounded. Control wasn't what I wanted. But dignity? That I needed. I asked Stephen to send me everything he could about the venue's contract terms. While waiting, I opened my calendar. Every payment I'd made was logged: the catter's advance, the band's booking fee, even the non-refundable floral deposit. One by one, the numbers stacked like bricks in a wall. 42, 60, 30, that's what I'd given, for a day where I'd been erased. I leaned back in my chair. The sunlight hit the corner of a framed photo. Melissa at 7, in her Girl Scout sash, grinning with a missing tooth. I used to pack her lunch with heart-shaped notes. I wondered if she remembered. When Stephen called back, his tone was crisp. "You're listed as primary sponsor on 3 vendor agreements. Technically, they can't execute without your sign off." My fingers tightened around the phone. "But here's the thing," he continued. You can also rescind. Quietly. No announcement. Just non-payment or withdrawal. I stared out the window at the neighbor's dog rolling in the grass. I'm not ready to ruin her wedding, I whispered. Stephen was silent. Then, sometimes not ruining something means letting them see what they almost destroyed. I slept that night with a folded contract under my pillow. Not for drama, but for options. And when I woke up, I knew I wouldn't take the stage. I'd just wait for the microphone to come to me. The ceremony had ended. The vows were said, the rings exchanged, and the photos captured under golden light. But by the time Judith entered the reception hall, the warmth of that glow had already faded. Her name card was perched at the edge of table 12, near the swinging door to the kitchen, where the smell of steamed asparagus fought with the cold air every time a server rushed through. The restroom sign glowed just behind her chair. She glanced around. Rachel's old piano teacher had been seated closer to the bridal table than her own mother. Judith blinked. Her blouse suddenly felt too tight. There was no microphone at this end. No centerpiece. Just a chipped votive candle and a wrinkled linen napkin folded like a question mark. She slid into her chair slowly, smoothing the hem of her skirt. A young couple, Jake's college friends, glanced at her with polite indifference, then returned to talking about a new streaming series. Judith could smell wine on their breath. The woman mispronounced Rachel's name twice. She poured herself water from the sweating pitcher in the middle of the table. It tasted like fridge ice. Across the room, Stephen was already laughing with Jake's parents at the head table. Rachel sat next to Jake, her back straight, posture impeccable, veil tucked like a magazine spread. Judith noticed she was wearing the sapphire earrings, the ones Judith had planned to give her on her wedding day, until she overheard her daughter calling them dated and tacky. During a bridal fitting, Judith had put them back in the box. The clatter of silverware faded as the best man raised his glass. Toasts began. One by one, people stood, spoke, cried, joked. No one called on Judith. She waited through 3 toasts, then 4. The maid of honor mentioned every strong woman who shaped Rachel, and named a college professor, a yoga instructor, and Jake's mother. Judith felt something inside her buckle. Still she smiled. She reached for her tea, lukewarm now. Then came the 5th toast. A distant cousin stood and said, "To the couple who brought us all here today. To love, ambition, and youth." Judith thought she might throw up. Youth. The 6th toast came from a family friend who referred to the bride's independence in creating her dream wedding. Judith looked down at her plate, untouched. A quiet voice broke through. "Grandma Judy, want to come sit with me?" Judith turned. Emily, her granddaughter, stood beside her, small hands clasping a plastic cup of sparkling juice. She wore a tiny version of the bridesmaid dress. Her curls were messy, her eyes soft. "I saved a chair," she whispered. Judith's throat tightened. She glanced toward the head table. Rachel hadn't noticed. Stephen had. He gave her a tight smile. That was all. "Thank you, sweetheart," Judith said, "but I think I'll stay here for now." Emily nodded, disappointed but not surprised. She placed a paper napkin on the table beside Judith's plate. On it, in purple crayon, she had drawn a flower and written, "Best Grandma." Judith folded it carefully, tucked it into her clutch. When dinner came, hers was cold. The chicken overcooked, the mashed potatoes rubbery. No one at her table spoke to her. She ate 3 bites, sipped her tea, smiled, and inside, something was beginning to steal. She looked down at the receipt still tucked inside her handbag. The venue deposit, the cake payment, the dress fittings. She had funded half this event, and yet there was no seat at her daughter's table. Not really. The music swelled. People danced. Judith stayed seated. She let the room blur around her. Then, slowly, she stood, picked up her handbag, straightened her blouse, and walked toward the garden outside, where the air was cool, and the silence, at last, belonged only to her. The room dimmed as the cake was wheeled in. 5 tiers of fondant and fresh roses, towering like a monument to careful planning. The DJ cued soft jazz. People drifted back to their seats, forks ready. Judith stood just inside the open doors, on the edge of the garden, where laughter hadn't reached. Her breath slowed. The air out here was hers, clean, unjudged. She didn't expect the hush that fell inside. She didn't expect Harold Whitmore to stand. She caught the movement through the glass. That familiar posture. Shoulders straight, chin slightly lifted, the same man who used to walk job sites in snow boots and a tie. He held a flute of champagne in one hand, and with the other he tapped a spoon. Clink, clink. Silence. Judith stepped closer to the doorway, staying behind a column. Invisible again, but this time by choice. Harold cleared his throat. "I wasn't going to speak tonight," he began. "Frankly, I wasn't sure I was invited." Nervous chuckles. He turned toward the bridal table. But as I sat there, watching this beautiful celebration unfold, something struck me. I've stood in many rooms like this, but never in one I didn't know the bones of. He paused. Judith felt her heart quicken. "See this ballroom?" He gestured around, slowly. "These archways. This crown molding. This layout. It was designed by a woman, a mother, a pioneer, a damn fine engineer." Every head turned. He looked out across the room. Judith Meyers built this place. A collective ripple. Gasps. Even a few phones raised. Rachel went rigid. Harold kept going. "I was there when she laid the plans. When she argued to add 6 more feet to the windows for natural light. Said brides deserve better photos." A low murmur passed through the guests. I watched her show up to meetings with a toddler on her hip and still outwork 5 men. She didn't just build rooms. She built respect. Judith stood still. The air seemed heavier now. Pressed against her, Harold raised his glass. "So here's to legacy, and to not forgetting the women who made our memories possible." He drank. Alone for half a second. Then one glass lifted. Then another, then applause. Judith blinked hard. She saw Rachel force a smile. A whisper exchanged with Jake. His brow furrowed. Someone said, "Why didn't they say that earlier?" Judith turned away before they could look for her. Outside, a small voice piped up. "Aunt Judy, did you hear?" It was Emily, crayon-smeared napkin still clutched in her little hand. Judith crouched. "I did, darling." Emily looked excited. "I filmed it. I'm gonna post it on Dad's old YouTube. It deserves to be shared." Judith smiled, really smiled for the first time all day. "That's a powerful thing you're doing." "Telling the truth." Emily nodded proudly. "You matter." That's what Grandpa always said. Judith hugged her, and in the hum of twilight, applause still echoing inside, she finally felt something click back into place. She hadn't asked for recognition, but she wouldn't run from it either. Judith stepped back into the building with the slow resolve of someone who had just witnessed a fault line shift. The applause still echoed faintly through the marble corridors. But in the hallway near the bridal suite, there was only heat. And Rachel's voice. "He had no right. That was not part of the plan." Judith paused behind a half-closed door. Through the sliver, she saw Rachel pacing in heels too high, hands flailing, voice shrill. "Do you know how that made me look? Like I forgot my own mother! Like I was raised in a cave!" Jake tried to calm her. "Babe, it wasn't a big deal. He just wanted to honor her. She built the venue. That's kind of epic." Rachel turned on him. "You think it's epic that she hijacked my wedding?" Judith turned and walked away before she heard the rest. She didn't need to. Back at her table, the chicken had congealed into paste. She picked up her clutch and slipped out the side door. Outside, the cool air calmed her hands. But her mind churned. The Harold moment wasn't a twist. It was a crack in the performance. And Judith, a woman who'd spent decades studying structural faults, knew what came next. Collapse. She returned home that evening with sore feet and a whisper of clarity. She poured herself a small bourbon, turned on the kitchen light, reached for her manila folder of wedding documents. Labeled, July 2025. Receipts, emails, printouts, including the shared Google Sheet Rachel had sent months ago. Budget NAR 61,500. Judith had been listed as partial sponsor, but something caught her eye. On the new printout she'd received at the rehearsal dinner, that line was gone. The venue cost was still $25,000, but the column marked, paid by, now read, bride and groom, her name had been erased. Judith flipped back through old emails, found the original sheet, opened it, then opened the new one, side by side, row by row, tiny changes, word swaps, attribution lines removed. Her floral deposit now labeled Anonymous Donor, she stared. Judith had built entire public projects, hospitals, schools, storm shelters. She knew how to read between the lines, and these lines told her this Rachel had scrubbed her. Not just from the guest list, from the record. She clicked into Roseland Events portal, used the login she'd insisted on keeping when she paid the deposit, password legacy 74. The dashboard loaded, Judith Meyers, primary client. She clicked double load, saved every file, every note. She called Stephen. I'm ready. He didn't ask what changed. He only said, let's move carefully, quietly. We hold the frame. Let them panic inside it. Judith hung up. The last document she opened was the initial design invoice. At the bottom, the designer had written, Custom Ballroom Layout Approved by JM. She smiled, and for the first time in weeks, she slept through the night. The scanner hummed like a distant wasp. Judith sat in her home office, slippered feet tucked beneath her, a blanket draped over one shoulder. The bourbon glass from earlier sat empty, casting a crescent shadow across her desk. Page after page fed through the machine, invoices, check stubs, itemized receipts. She cataloged everything. Digital folders labeled Vienu, Katarien Efiloral Duras, Messi, each name tight and clear like beams in a frame. The cursor blinked on the file titled Totals. Judith paused, then opened her calculator. Vinvenue 18,750 catering 9,200 dressy 3 does 6,600 florals 2,800 music the $400 lighting and DA core than 1,080 miscellaneous 3,100 total 42 80 30. She stared at the number, then wrote it in pen on the inside cover of a marble notebook. At the top of the page, she wrote the wedding I wasn't in. She was 3 lines into drafting a timeline when a soft knock startled her. Emily. The girl padded in, dragging a stuffed elephant by the trunk. I couldn't sleep, she whispered. Judith smiled. Me neither. Emily climbed onto the couch beside her. Did you see how mad Mom was? After the speech, Judith gave a soft chuckle. I noticed. Emily held up her tablet. I uploaded the video. It already has 2,000 views. Judith blinked. That many? Someone commented. She built that place. Ligandi. Judith laughed quietly. That's generous. Emily leaned against her. I think it's true. For a moment, Judith forgot the betrayal. They sat like that, 2 shadows against soft lamplight, the scanner still clicking behind them, until Judith turned to her notebook again. December 2024 withdrawn 10,000 from joint college savings. She frowned. She flipped through her banking app, eyes narrowing. Emily an education fund. Balance 2,150. She checked the previous logs. Down from the 12,000. Transferred to Rachel M. Evans Event Payment Services. Judith blinked slowly. They had drained her granddaughter's college fund. For a wedding that banished the woman who built it. She felt something cold settle behind her ribs. She looked down at Emily's hand, now asleep in her lap. Judith closed the ledger. Tomorrow, she'd begin the real accounting. Not of dollars, but of dignity. The emails went out just after 5:12 a.m. Not a single one carried emotion, no flourishes, no threats. Just language as clean and sharp as the steel beams she once calculated to the 10th decimal. Per our agreement dated February 3, 2025, please consider this formal notice of sponsor withdrawal. Due to unapproved budget reallocations, I request a full itemization of disbursed funds within 5 business days. Please update the client of record to reflect corrected authorization ownership, effective immediately. She didn't sign them, Mom, or even Judith. She signed them J. Myers, PE professional engineer, the initials they could never take away. By 600 M, she had scheduled 3 certified mailings, queued an automatic document backup, and instructed Stephen to begin quiet retrievals from accounts where she was still listed. No calls, no meetings, no confrontation. Control doesn't always require noise. It requires proof. And Judith had folders full. By 8:13 a.m., the Roseland Events portal reflected a change client of record updated to secondary contact. She was no longer primary, but not gone, because she had never fully surrendered. She brewed a fresh pot of tea and sat with her list. A new document. Corrections. Venue. Requested 4th 250 refund non-utilized hours. Florist canceled remaining floral installation. Catering paused final delivery payment banned. Requested contract revision owner change. The ballroom would still stand. The wedding would still have music, but not on Betrayal's dime. She closed her laptop and took a long sip. For the first time in weeks, her reflection didn't flinch. Outside, Emily ran across the lawn chasing bubbles. Judith watched her, notebook in lap, fingers tapping. Then she opened a new file. Letter to Emily, to be opened at 18. She typed the first lines, "Dear Emily, if you're reading this, it means I kept a promise to all. To make sure you were never erased." She stopped, breathed, then kept typing. It began at 9:03 a.m. on a Wednesday. Rachel had just poured herself a green smoothie when her email pinged. Subject access revoked. Meyers' family wedding fund. She frowned, tapped it open. Bang, her phone buzzed. Bank alert, shared account access terminated. Before she could dial, Jake shouted from the other room, "Hey babe, did you change the cake invoice? They just said we owe another deposit." Rachel's chest tightened. "What?" Her inbox refreshed again. Florist contract cancellation received. Roseland events. Sponsorship withdrawn. Venue partial refund issued. She reread the words. Then ran upstairs. "Mom," she called. But of course, Judith wasn't there. She hadn't been there in days. Judith sat calmly in her sunroom, light slicing through the blinds in quiet grids. Her teacup steamed. On the table beside her sat a small stack, a copy of the legal summary, notarized documents, and 3 returned checks. One was addressed to Rosalind, one to the florist, and the last, unopened, to Rachel and Jake. She didn't need to open it. She knew what it said. "You spent what wasn't yours." Her phone buzzed. "Stephen, all changes confirmed," he said. "No further authorizations exist in their names. Everything's back where it started." Judith exhaled. "Thank you." He paused. "They're gonna push back." She smiled faintly. "Then let them push against marble." By noon, Rachel was pacing the driveway barefoot, phone pressed tight to her cheek. "She can't do this! That money was a gift!" Jake muttered. "It was never written that way. She made us sign that payment agreement. She tricked us." She protected herself. Rachel turned on him. "Are you on her side now?" He looked away. By 3:17 p.m., the mail arrived. Inside the envelope was a 2-page summary reallocation of sponsorship and withdrawal of parental support. Under it, a single handwritten note, "You erased the wrong woman." Rachel dropped the paper, her smoothie spilled. Jake sat down on the stairs, elbows on his knees. Outside, the neighborhood kids rode their bikes. Inside, silence throbbed. Judith didn't gloat, she gardened. She replanted her thyme. She folded her sheets. She drank water from the glass pitcher she loved. Then, she opened a new file labeled Next Steps. At the top, she wrote, "Silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it means you're sharpening the shears." Back at the wedding suite, Rachel opened her laptop. Her browser wouldn't load the planning app. Error, permissions required. She slammed it shut. Behind her, Jake murmured, "Maybe we fix this. Maybe we apologize." Rachel stared at him. Judith, she realized, had never raised her voice, never thrown a glass, never stormed out. But somehow she'd changed everything, in just one day. The final song at the wedding wasn't a slow dance. It was a preloaded playlist that looped back to the first track. No one noticed. By Sunday morning, half the flowers had wilted. The hotel staff boxed leftover pastries with silent efficiency. Guests checked out without lingering. There were no brunches, no gift openings, no stories swapped over pancakes. Just a draft of silence settling over every room, the kind that creeps under doors, clings to curtains, and hums in the spaces where laughter used to be. Rachel stayed in bed. She didn't cry. She stared at the ceiling, jaw tight, replaying Judith's note in her head, a note she hadn't even read herself. Jake had. She'd refused to touch it. Jake packed, quietly, without prompting. He placed the suits back into garment bags, removed the wrinkled table numbers from his backpack, and folded a white linen napkin with Judith's initials embroidered in gold. He stared at the embroidery for a long time. At 10:32 m, Emily knocked on Judith's door. The knock was soft, hesitant. Not the kind of knock that expected an answer, but the kind that hoped anyway. There was no answer. Inside the room, Judith was already gone. All that remained was a note, folded neatly on the dresser. "Tell your parents I left before the guilt arrived. Tell you I'll always answer when you call. Love, Grandma J." Emily read it 3 times. Then she placed it in her pocket like something precious. She didn't cry either. She just stood there silently for a long time, as if holding her breath would hold the moment. Judith drove north, through winding Colorado roads that once held echoes of laughter, crying babies, spilled coffee, and music turned up too loud. Past the reservoir where Jake caught his first fish and screamed in triumph. Past the overlook where Rachel, at 17, had wept over a rejection letter, throwing it into the wind as if it could unwrite her disappointment. Judith didn't cry. She kept both hands on the wheel. She let the wind speak. The steady hum of tires on asphalt sounded like resolve. There was something holy about the quiet. At 47 p.m., she arrived at the cabin, the old family place tucked between pine and aspen. It hadn't been touched in years. A bird's nest curled above the porch lamp. Dust lined the edges of the welcome mat. The key, rusted but loyal, turned with a soft groan. The lock clicked open like it had been waiting for her. Inside, the air was still, but not dead. There was memory in the walls, the kind that didn't fade with distance. She could hear echoes of small feet running down the hall, of summer lemonade, of fire crackling during October storms. There had been joy here, and tension, and truth. She unpacked lightly 2 sweaters, a journal, 1 book of poetry, and the letter to Emily, now sealed. She placed the envelope in the drawer beneath the kettle. A legacy shouldn't shout. It should wait. And then, when the time is right, speak clearly. Judith boiled water, opened the windows, aired out the bedding. Her movements were methodical. She made the bed with the corners tucked tight, the way she used to when Rachel was little and afraid of monsters slipping under loose blankets. She moved slowly, not from age, but from precision, from decision. She cleaned. She dusted shelves no one had touched in years. She wiped the frame of a photograph still standing on the mantel. Rachel, at age 6, missing 2 front teeth, hugging a puppy they no longer had. Judith traced the curve of the smile with her thumb, then returned the photo gently to its place. She didn't flinch. The pain didn't spike. It hovered, present but manageable, like an old injury that tightens in the rain. She prepared tea with honey, her favorite blend of chamomile and lavender. The scent filled the small cabin. It reminded her of late nights after double shifts, when the only reward was a warm mug and a moment of solitude. She opened her notebook. She wrote a single line. Power reclaimed in silence often echoes the loudest. She stared at it, nodded, and underlined the word, reclaimed. At twilight, Judith stood by the window, tea in hand, watching the dusk press into the trees. The sky blushed faintly, streaked with lavender and rust. A heron drifted low over the water beyond the cabin, its wings cutting through the air in slow motion. Her hands were steady. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even sad. She was rested, like something had exhaled inside her, like her spine no longer carried the invisible weight of trying to prove her worth. For the first time in weeks, months, maybe years, she felt like she was enough. Not because someone said so, but because she remembered it. She let the silence wrap around her like a shawl. Her phone buzzed once. Emily. Just a photo of her holding the note, and a message, I'm proud you're my grandma. Judith stared at the screen for a long time. She let the words wash over her. Not like a wave, but like warm rain on soil, quiet, steady, life-giving. Then she exhaled, and let the stillness become peace. She walked back to the kitchen, lit a candle, and pulled her chair closer to the window. The tea was still warm. The candle flickered gently. Outside, the trees didn't ask anything of her. They simply stood, the way she now would. Not to be seen, but to remain. The cabin sat quietly on the edge of the lake, where the early light brushed the water in gold. Judith unlocked the door with a key that no longer jingled beside others. Just one key now. One place that mattered. She stepped inside, took a slow breath, and smelled cedar, old books, and last night's rain clinging to the windows. The shelves, once bare, were now lined with hand-labeled spines. Letters never mailed. Journals found in drawers. Poems for the unspoken. Each book came from someone who had been dismissed, underestimated, or made to feel invisible. Some were donations. Some arrived anonymously. Some Judith had written herself. She moved slowly, hands brushing spines like skin, absorbing the weight of lives. Her knees ached, but she didn't sit down yet. The stillness wasn't empty, it was earned. Outside, the birch trees were swaying. They had shed leaves quietly, without asking for applause. Judith looked out the window, her breath fogging the glass, and thought of the wedding again. The click of Rachel's heels, the mic in her manicured hand, the sound of 200 people laughing. And then the silence. She had walked through fire that night and never once raised her voice. Judith sat at the main table now, the one near the window, and opened a worn leather-bound journal. She added a new entry to a section she called Things They Never Knew. I wanted to tell you how many nights I sat awake, not angry, just stunned that my own daughter believed my dreams expired with my youth. I wanted to ask what part of love allows public ridicule. I wanted to understand why I still hoped for her voice on the phone, even after everything. But I stayed silent, and in that silence, I built something. Judith paused. Her hand trembled slightly as she closed the journal. She placed it among others. Then came a knock. She opened the door to find a woman, perhaps 50, maybe younger, hard to tell, holding a paper bag and looking unsure. Are you the woman from the story? She asked. The one who owns the place, who didn't clap back but walked her truth. Judith smiled, soft and without pride. I might be. The woman held out the bag. I brought old letters. From my grandmother. I didn't know where else they could be safe. Judith accepted them with both hands. Would you like to come in? She asked. They sat together in the library. No need for introductions. Some silences don't need names to be understood. The woman cried quietly. Judith poured tea. As sunlight shifted on the floorboards, more people came. One by one. Some with boxes, others with nothing but stories carried in their eyes. Emily returned too. Older, steadier. She became the quiet keeper of the space, reading aloud on Sundays, dusting every spine with care. She called it the house where women remembered themselves. On one wall hung a frame with no photo, just stitched words. I stayed kind. That was my rebellion, and that was legacy. Not revenge, not titles, but the refusal to disappear. One afternoon, a boy, maybe 11, wandered in, tugging his grandmother's coat. She said, "This place has stories you can't find on YouTube?" He mumbled. Judith knelt, smiling. Will he keep the ones that matter, even when the world forgets to listen? In that moment, she felt something lift from her chest. The last trace of needing anyone's permission. That night, she wrote one final page in the journal. I wasn't meant to be famous. I was meant to be free. I wasn't meant to be loud. I was meant to be heard. And I wasn't meant to end quietly. This is my legacy, not what I lost, but what I left behind. She closed the book, blew out the candle, and let the quiet wrap around her like a song only the healed can hum. If this story reminded you of someone who was once overlooked, disrespected, or made to feel too old to matter, share it. Tell us, have you ever rebuilt your life after 65? Have you been mocked for starting over? Comment below with your city. Let us know where the stories of quiet power are still unfolding. Your voice might be the one that helps another woman begin again. This isn't the end. It's a beginning we write together.